My name is Sandra. I am 32 years old, and I have been married to Mark for 5 years. Our marriage had always been full of passion and complicity right from the start. But lately, something seemed to have faded. Everyday life had taken over, and our relationship seemed to have settled into a flat, predictable routine. Mark was always busy with work. I tried to fill my days between household chores and small errands, but I felt a void, a need for something different. So, when Mark proposed spending the summer at his parents' villa in the countryside, I accepted without thinking too much. I thought that a change of scenery would be good for both of us, and the house was beautiful. A large villa with an immense garden, surrounded by greenery and a pool that promised relaxing days under the warm July sun. Mark worked remotely, locked in his office for hours, while I enjoyed the tranquility of the place between reading and long swims. It was during one of those days that I noticed Tony, Mark's father, in a different way. Tony had always been an attractive man, and even though he was 60 years old, he looked much younger. Tall, athletic build, salt and pepper hair, and deep green eyes that seemed to read the soul of anyone they looked at. He had never been anything more than my husband's father to me, but that morning, something changed. He was getting out of the pool, water sliding down his body, and I couldn't help but notice the strength of his muscles, his relaxed smile. I felt a slight embarrassment, as if I had crossed an invisible line, but at the same time, a growing curiosity began to take root inside me. In the days that followed, I began to notice Tony more and more. He was a constant presence, with that confident way of moving. And every time our eyes met, I felt a shiver run down my spine. I felt a bit guilty for those thoughts. I was married to his son, and yet I couldn't ignore the attraction that was starting to grow inside me. Every now and then, when Mark was not at home, Tony would invite me for a swim. At first, I accepted lightly, trying not to give weight to those moments, but each time we found ourselves close in the water, the tension became more palpable. One evening, while Mark was engaged in a long work call, Tony proposed a nighttime swim in the pool. "The sky is so beautiful tonight," he said with a gentle smile. There was something in his tone of voice, a subtle invitation that I couldn't refuse. I put on my swimsuit and we headed towards the pool. The water was warm, and the cool night air seemed to envelop us like a blanket. Tony swam beside me, and when I turned towards him, our eyes met. "You are truly a beautiful woman, Sandra," he whispered, and my heart began to beat hard, as if something had suddenly awakened inside me. That night was just the beginning. After that first swim, Tony began to increasingly seek moments to be alone with me. Sometimes he asked me to accompany him to the garden. Other times he suggested a walk in the surroundings. I was torn between the desire to distance myself and the irresistible charm of those forbidden moments. One evening, while Mark was sleeping, Tony joined me by the pool. He looked at me for a long time, his eyes filled with something I couldn't decipher. "I'd like to know you better, Sandra," he said with a calm but intense voice. I blushed, but inside me something was melting. "I don't know if it's a good idea," I replied, trying to maintain a detached tone, but he smiled a smile that made me tremble. "Maybe it's not right, but I know you want it too," he replied. And he was right. I felt attracted to him in a way I couldn't explain, and for the first time I felt a desire that wasn't for Mark, but for another man, my father-in-law. The tension grew day by day. One afternoon, while I was in the pool enjoying the sun, Tony approached and sat on the edge, his gaze fixed on me. "Can I join you?" he asked in a tone that admitted no refusal. I nodded, unable to answer with words. He entered the water with a light dive and slowly approached until our bodies almost touched. Every move seemed calculated, every gesture an implicit invitation. "You are so beautiful," he said softly. His hand brushed my arm underwater, and an electric jolt went through me. I stood still, paralyzed by inner conflict. "We shouldn't do this," I whispered, but my voice was weak. My body betrayed the desire I felt. Tony didn't stop. He looked straight into my eyes and whispered, "I think we should just follow what we feel." And at that moment, his lips moved towards mine. Just a light touch, but enough to ignite a spark that could no longer be ignored. I pulled away immediately, my heart pounding. "I'm sorry," I murmured, trying to get out of the water, but Tony held me by the arm. "Don't apologize, Sandra," he said gently. There's nothing wrong with desire. After that kiss, the world seemed to change color. Every glance from Tony was a promise, every word a subtle invitation. I avoided being alone with him. I tried to stay close to Mark, but the tension was now unbearable. In every free moment, my thoughts returned to that touch, to that kiss, stolen under the moon. One day, while I was hanging my swimsuit to dry, Tony reached me. I thought you liked last night, he whispered with a mischievous smile. We shouldn't, I replied, trying to sound convinced, but my eyes betrayed my uncertainty. He moved closer, his voice low and magnetic. I can't stop thinking about you, he confessed, and in that moment, I felt overwhelmed by a wave of contrasting emotions. The rational part of me screamed to run away, but my heart raced and my senses awakened. It was as if my whole body was responding to the call of a desire I could no longer deny. That evening, Mark was again engaged in a long work call. I found myself in the pool trying to distract myself, but my thoughts were still confused. I heard a noise behind me, and when I turned around, I saw Tony watching me. Can I join you? He asked, and without saying a word, I nodded. We swam together, our bodies close in the water, and with every movement, I felt the warmth of his body approach mine. Why are you fighting this, Sandra? He asked suddenly, stopping in front of me. I had no answer. Because it's wrong, I finally replied, but my voice betrayed doubt. What's wrong with seeking happiness? He replied, moving even closer. I was now a step away from him. I could feel his breath, and when our lips met again this time, there was no hesitation. The kiss was deep, passionate, and I felt a wave of heat invade me. When we pulled away, we were both breathless, and I knew that something had changed forever. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling of anguish and excitement. I looked at myself in the mirror, wondering what had happened the previous night, and if it was really me who had kissed Tony, my father-in-law. Mark asked me if I was okay, noticing my distraction. I replied with a forced smile, trying to hide the turmoil I felt inside. Tony was in the next room, and I felt his gaze on me even when I couldn't see him. While Mark went out for an errand, Tony joined me in the kitchen. We need to talk, he said, and the tone of his voice made me shiver. We can't ignore what happened, he continued. I nodded, unable to find the right words. I know it's complicated, he said, but I can't pretend anymore that you mean nothing to me. His confession took me by surprise, and I felt my heart beat faster. Me neither, I replied in a low voice. That admission opened a door of no return that we both knew we had already crossed. The following days were a mix of passion and torment. Every opportunity to meet alone was a chance to touch, to steal a hidden kiss. Tony found excuses to get close to me. He touched me lightly when Mark wasn't looking, whispered words in my ear that made me blush. I felt his desire growing, and mine increased with it, but every time I touched him, I also felt a deep sense of guilt. One evening, while Mark was having dinner with friends, Tony took my hand and led me to the pool again. This time, there were no hesitations. He kissed me passionately, pushing me against the edge, and I surrendered completely. His body was warm against mine. His hands explored my skin with a familiarity that seemed innate. My heart was pounding, and every sensation was amplified by the knowledge of how wrong it was. Our forbidden game continued in the following days. Every furtive meeting, every stolen kiss, every whisper in my ear made me feel more alive than I had ever felt. But at the same time, the weight of the secret was becoming unbearable. I felt increasingly guilty towards Mark, who seemed oblivious to everything. His blind trust in me broke my heart. Sometimes at night I watched him sleep and wondered how I could continue living with this burden. But then, the next day, when Tony looked at me with his piercing eyes, the thought of guilt vanished in an instant. One afternoon, while Mark was out for work, Tony asked me to follow him to one of the most remote rooms of the villa, away from prying eyes. We need to talk to understand what we're doing, he said seriously. But when he closed the door behind me, his gaze betrayed another kind of intention. I can't keep living knowing that I desire you so much without being able to have you, he confessed, his tone a mixture of frustration and passion. I approached him, my body trembling with emotion. Me neither, I whispered, and his lips merged with mine again. Tony asked me to make a decision. We can't go on like this, he told me one evening as we sat by the pool. the sound of the water filling the silence between us. "You have to choose, Sandra. Him or me." I felt my heart stop for a moment. How could I choose between the security of a stable marriage and the overwhelming passion I felt for Tony? It was an impossible choice, and I felt paralyzed by doubt. Mark began to notice my strange behavior. He asked me if something was wrong, and I tried to reassure him with a forced smile. "I'm just tired," I replied, but inside I knew that our secret was getting closer and closer to being discovered. He started asking questions about me and Tony, noticing our growing complicity. "It seems like you and my father have been getting along very well lately," he commented one evening, and I stiffened. "Yes, it's just a coincidence," I replied with a nervous laugh, but I knew that suspicion was starting to creep in. Tony, on the other hand, seemed increasingly confident. "Don't worry," he told me, "Mark doesn't suspect anything." But I could see that change in his eyes. I felt the weight of every lie, of every fleeting glance, and I wondered how long we could continue lying before everything exploded. The day I feared came suddenly. Mark came home earlier than expected one afternoon and found Tony and me too close, too familiar. We weren't doing anything compromising, but the way our bodies moved apart at his entrance, like two lovers caught in the act, was enough to trigger an alarm. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice full of suspicion and concern. My heart began to pound, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. Tony spoke first, trying to downplay it, but his voice trembled slightly. "Nothing, Mark. We were just chatting." But Mark didn't seem convinced. His eyes moved between me and his father, searching for answers that neither of us was ready to give. "Sandra?" he asked, and I felt the full weight of the truth pressing on my chest. I couldn't lie anymore, not like this, not in front of him. I felt the tears rise, and before I could stop them, I began to cry. "Mark, I'm sorry," I murmured, my voice broken by pain and guilt. "I'm really sorry." Mark turned pale as if he had just been punched in the stomach. "What are you sorry for, Sandra?" he asked, his voice hard, cutting like a knife. I looked at Tony, hoping for support, but he seemed paralyzed, unable to speak. I took a deep breath. Tony and I have gotten closer," I finally confessed, "much more than we should have." Mark stepped back as if my words had physically hit him. "What?" he whispered in disbelief. "How could you, Sandra?" "And you, Dad? How could you do this to me?" Tony tried to speak, to justify himself, but Mark wouldn't listen. "You are both traitors," he shouted. "You destroyed me." I felt the weight of his despair, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. After the confession, everything turned into an emotional chaos. Mark left the villa without saying a word, his heavy footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Tony and I looked at each other, both aware of the gravity of our actions. "What will we do now?" I asked, my voice reduced to a trembling whisper. Tony took my hands, his fingers warm against my cold ones. "I have to talk to him, explain to him," he said, but it seemed more like a vain hope than a certainty. I spent the night alone, in tears, the guilt crushing my chest. I thought back to all the moments with Mark, the smiles, the hugs, and I felt a deep pain that shattered me inside. I knew I had hurt the person I loved, and that nothing would ever be the same again. Tony didn't return until the morning, and when he finally arrived, he had a grim expression. "He doesn't want to talk to me," he said, his voice broken by frustration. "He won't listen. He says he wants nothing to do with us." I felt the world collapse around me, realizing we had lost everything: love, trust, family. For days, we tried to reach Mark, to explain, to ask for forgiveness, but he refused to answer the calls, to read the messages. Every attempt crashed against a wall of silence. Tony seemed destroyed, his eyes increasingly empty, his smile gone. I don't know what to do. He confessed to me one evening while we sat in the kitchen. I disappointed him in a way he will never forgive. I felt responsible for the pain we had caused, but I couldn't completely regret what we had experienced together. "Maybe we should let him go," I whispered, my voice choked with tears. Tony shook his head. "I can't lose my son, not like this." And so we continued to look for a way to talk to him, to make him understand that despite everything, We still wanted to be a family. But every day that passed, the distance between us seemed only to increase. After weeks of silence, Mark finally agreed to meet us. He gave us an appointment at a cafe out of town, away from prying eyes. When I saw him, my heart broke. He had lost weight, his face was drawn, dark circles under his eyes. He sat across from us without saying a word, his gaze cold and distant. "I'm here just to understand one thing," he began, his voice flat and emotionless. "Why?" His question hit me like a punch in the stomach. I didn't know what to answer. "There's no easy answer," I murmured. "It happened, and we never wanted to hurt you." Mark shook his head bitterly. "You don't care about me, you never have," he accused. Tony tried to intervene. "Mark, it's not like that, please." But Mark raised a hand, interrupting him. "Enough, I'm done. I don't want to see you again, ever." He stood up and left, leaving us alone with broken hearts. Life, after that meeting, became a series of empty and meaningless days. Mark no longer wanted to have contact with us, and every attempt to mend the relationship failed miserably. Tony seemed to sink deeper and deeper into sadness, and I didn't know how to comfort him. Our relationship, once so intense and passionate, was now shrouded in guilt and pain that seemed impossible to dissolve. I decided to take a break, to distance myself from the villa and the situation that had led us to destroy everything we had built. I moved in with a friend in the city, trying to sort out my thoughts. Tony tried to convince me to stay, but he knew I needed space. "Maybe it's better this way for a while," he said sadly. "Maybe I'll be able to regain Mark's trust, and you can figure out what you really want." And so we parted, not knowing if we would ever find each other again. The months that followed were full of painful and deep reflections. I tried to understand what had driven me to betray Mark, to let myself be swept away by such a forbidden desire. I realized it had been a mix of boredom, insecurity, and perhaps a desperate search for emotions that I felt were missing in my life. But despite everything, I couldn't regret the time spent with Tony. That time had made me feel alive, desired, loved in a way I had never experienced before. On the other hand, I missed Mark, his reassuring presence, his sincere affection. I missed the stability he had always represented for me. I kept asking myself if there would ever be a chance for redemption, to repair the damage we had caused. But every time I thought about approaching him, I remembered his gaze full of pain and contempt, and I understood that perhaps it was too late. One day, while I was in the city, I received a call from an unknown number. It was Tony. "Sandra?" he said, with a calm but determined voice. "I want to see you. I've thought a lot about all of this, and I think we need to talk seriously." I hesitated for a moment, not knowing what to expect. "All right," I finally replied. "Tell me where and when." We met in a small park, far from our usual places. Tony seemed different, more serene, almost resolute. "I've decided to leave everything behind," he said. "I need a fresh start, far from here, far from the memories that tie me to this pain." He looked me in the eyes. "I want you to come with me." I was speechless. "I can't," I replied. "I can't just leave everything." But he insisted. "I'm not saying it will be easy, but we can't keep living like this. We have a choice. We can try to build something new or stay stuck in a past that will destroy us." I spent days reflecting on Tony's proposal. My heart told me to go, to follow that feeling that still burned inside me, but my mind reminded me of everything I would leave behind. Mark, my family, the life I had built with sacrifice and love. Every choice seemed to bring inevitable pain. In the end, I decided to meet Tony one last time. "I can't come with you," I told him, my voice trembling but determined. "I have to stay here and face the consequences of my actions." Tony looked at me with a sadness in his eyes that I had never seen before. "I understand," he replied. "I respect your decision." We hugged, a long and painful embrace, knowing it would be the last. The story has concluded, but if you want to hear more stories, intimate confessions, click on one of the videos you see on the screen. And remember to subscribe to the channel to get new intriguing stories every day.